and sorry I'm being casual today. I've just been a little under the weather, so I figure I'd rather show up dressed casually in my seminary polo shirt though, so that makes up for it. You watched the videos from last week. You noticed the awkwardness of the different camera angles. You liked that?
Yes.
Staring straight into it. Good. Any questions about the material from those? Hopefully there were some good challenges. Like I said, I'm going to intentionally be contentious. It's part of my job.
I thought the Tim Keller video was just right on point, and it really made me think about how the education, Christian is evolving. And he talked about not doing things the way we used to, and why people were not responding, I believe he said. I just thought the whole thing was really great. It gave me a lot of material, a lot to think about, and applying in my own ministry.
Excellent.
Agreed. And I think to his point, it sort of highlights some of the shortcomings of the Anthony book. Not that it's a bad book, but that it's Foundations for the 21st Century, and it was published in 2001. We had only had 1 year of the 21st century at that point, and it's been amazing how much the world has changed in 18 short years.
Yes.
Technology and the prevalence, the very self-conscious prevalence of some of those postmodern themes in our culture, not being the least of which, and those have a huge impact on our education.
Absolutely. Anything from either of you two?
I thought it was a lot of good information, but it's hard for me to apply it at work. Doing drug and alcohol counseling, I've even been told, well, my God wouldn't do that. My God wouldn't say that. My God wouldn't act that way. And that ends up turning into politics, and that can be talked about because it interferes with the message I'm trying to get out, that you guys are drunks and drug addicts, and I'm here to help you do that. And every fifth week, I get to show them a film, but they're all Christian-based films, like Fireproof. It has Kirk Cameron in it. You're familiar with it?
Yep.
Him and his wife. Great movie. It's showing people to, once you find something, stick with it and work with it, and here's how you can work through your problems. And that's the closest as I can get to witnessing to any of them. So
Fantastic. Bobby, you had a strong reaction there.
Well, he said that, and
my God.
very recently there was some news floating around about Lady Gaga taking the vice president to task over the fact that his wife works at a Christian school where they have certain views on homosexuality. And so it's funny because Michael Kruger, who's the president of RTS in Charlotte, wrote an article basically talking about, Lady Gaga, Christian theologian. And he said, one breath she's, spewing out expletives about the president, and the next she's taking the moral high ground and talking about how unchristian it is for the vice president to be associated in these different ways, and Christianity is about these things. And she says, I'm a Christian woman, and this is what it's really about. And it's just very interesting because people feel such an ability to reinterpret, even like what Joe was saying, the very nature of God, based on their experience and preferences, and what would potentially be offensive or oppressive to their preferences.
well, and I almost got in a really bad argument with this woman. She said, well, you can't believe the Bible anyway. It's been, who did it even come from? You can't prove that. And you just can't believe that stuff. So the God I worship wouldn't do that. What church you go to? I don't go to church. And I really don't know why, you know more about it than I do, and I don't know where this comes from and how I could prove it to you, but there are articles out there saying that it's not legitimate. But I don't know what they are, and I don't know if they're right or.
But take my word for it. Somebody disagrees with you, and they do a really good job.
And I can't choke them anymore. They're not in uniform.
A wonderfully helpful term for all of you. Is source amnesia. This is something that we try and get you past. Scholars, if you are going to be a true man of God, if we had women in here, I would say if you're going to be a true woman of God as well, then you should be able to know your sources, know where information comes from. And I am not saying you need to memorize book, chapter, and verse. The way that my memory works, that is the hardest part for me. I remember concepts, but I also know how to look things up. But if you get into a discussion, I want you to ask yourself, because this is essential to Christian education, can you validate your perspective with a reasonable source of information? You have to remember sort of where things come from. Where did you learn information? So source amnesia is a technical term we use in two different ways. First, you don't remember where you learned a lot of things as a child, because childhood amnesia. It's not saying you forget everything as a child, it's just you don't know where you learned it. You only have implicit memory, you don't have explicit memory for the first 3 to 5 years of your life. You might have a memory of a trauma before that, but it's rare. Otherwise, you have filled in, you have rebuilt memory with other people's stories of what you did. I have a memory of sitting on my grandmother's lap in this chair, and we have a photograph, black and white photograph of me sitting on her lap. Great, I was 2 months old. Then she died. But I've heard the story so often that I reconstructed a memory of it. And that's a difficult thing for us to get into, is memory every time you visit it is reconstructed. That's why eyewitness testimony is not always really good. Sometimes it's great, but we have to take with a grain of salt at times if it's a story you've heard again and again and again. That story of sitting on my grandmother's lap I've heard so many times, but people described the chair in such different ways that when a cousin showed me a photograph that was in color of that chair, it looked nothing like I remembered, because it was recovered when she died when I was a few months old. The way that people described, say it was tan with blue and red. Well, it was a blue chair that had some tan lines on it and barely had any red at all. But it was the way it was described to me, I had this image in my mind. If we're going to talk about where we have learned information, we recognize source amnesia. Do you remember where you learned something? And as people of God, you do have a responsibility of backing up what you say. Part of Christian education is that it is trustworthy. So if you say, well, I heard that, some of the most dangerous words in the English language. Well, I heard. Where'd you hear it from? Who is the source? And as scholars doing master's degrees, you have to think through, are those appropriate sources that are trustworthy, that are scholarly? And again, like Joe mentioned, don't get into politics here. Get into what is verifiable. And what is verifiable, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the philosophic issues, because hopefully you were really challenged with some of the readings for this week. I picked those to be really challenging, and we're going to discuss them today. But I do want you to think about source amnesia. Anytime that you can't remember who taught you something, it should automatically be something you look up or you throw into the category of, this is suspect information. Why am I being so coarse about this? So that you are making sure that you are speaking truth to people, not just reinforcing a previously held view, a preconceived notion that might be totally wrong. But if someone says, I believe this, why? I don't know, I just do. Does that always glorify God? That's usually where you hear a lot of the biggest problems in our churches. Ask yourself the dinner party question, and this is salient to what we're going to go over. The dinner party question of information. Which person are you going to believe? You're at a dinner party, you're sitting there with, this is a Presbyterian school, so you have a nice craft beer in your hand, okay? You have a nice craft beer in your hand and you're talking and someone says, well, you know, I think that we all need to be eating more fish. Okay. Do you have a basis for that? Well, you know, two things. One, when Jesus came back from the dead and appeared to his disciples, he ate two things. He ate broiled fish and honeycomb. So, Jesus' example. Second, you know, when Jesus is at the side of the river and they're coming back, or the lake, excuse me, slip there, and the disciples are coming back, and he's grilling for them, which sets a precedent for the last 2,000 years. The one thing men are supposed to do is grill, right? But what is he grilling? Toast and fish. Does that sway your imagination? Does that tell you we need to eat more fish? Yet it is biblical authority, right? Can be taken as such. Does that sway you, or does someone saying, well, according to the latest medical research, since I'm from a family that has a proclivity towards Alzheimer's disease, according to Mattson's 1996 study, having non-fried fish twice a week can decrease the expression of your apolipoprotein E allele status. If you have a proclivity towards developing Alzheimer's disease, it can cut your risk in half. Which sounds more believable, right? Which sounds more pressing. Yet both of them are true, but which has a scholarly perspective and which glorifies God with the information and which is stating something that is beautiful and meaningful, but is taken in a different context for a different meaning, right? These are the essential issues for us.
Was it this class or another one, or did I hear it somewhere else? I don't remember that.
Source amnesia, yeah!
Said the Bible told, the angel told Joseph, don't fear fear not to take Mary as your wife. So does that mean if you married somebody other than the name of Mary that you're wrong? Just figured it was taking things out of context.
That's
and
really
that's what
far
a lot
out of
people do.
context. I like that.
Description is not prescription.
Yeah.
And that's very important when you
Bingo.
look at the Bible, because there are lots of things that even God tells specific people to do in specific times that we ought not replicate in all times and all places.
Yeah,
Exactly.
like go and slay them all, man, woman, and child, kill their ox, goats, and sheep. What should I do today, Lord? Got it. And Mary, don't be afraid to marry Mary. And
Unless you got her in a-
Antichrist, wow.
Man, woman, child.
But proof texting is a real danger in the church, and a lot of churches do it. Now, there is a balance for us in Christian education. Do you just say proof texting is bad, or do you sometimes leave it to the power of the Holy Spirit to speak to you in new ways through a verse that you have read 1,000 times and you're just reading that verse? One of my favorite professors in seminary made a statement in the field of evangelism, and he said that it is very important we recognize that John 3:16 is only a part of a pericope with John 3:17. So to recite John 3:16 without John 3:17 is to weaponize the gospel. Wow. Weaponize the gospel. Now that's going overboard to make a point. It's not really weaponizing it, but if you drop out that last part about why, which is what John 3:17 is telling us, right? Why? Came not into the world not to judge the world, but that they might be saved. Or not to condemn the world is a better translation. I have too many of them going through my mind right now. You all have that problem, I bet.
Especially next to Jesus, I'm going to do I use King James or
Exactly. Hint. Erskine, start with the NIV. That's a hint.
I've got ESV and NASB here and NIV and King James at the house, so.
Yeah, and you can't go wrong. Well, let's talk a little bit about this week and the readings. What I'd like to do is to bring up some of the information. Remember, lectures are supposed to go beyond the reading or to challenge you on parts of the reading. So that's what I'd like to do. I'm gonna stop the video for a second and restart it so that it's cut up into smaller units.